Hello and welcome to Philosophy Archives. It is the autumn of 322 BC, and a 62-year-old philosopher is fleeing Athens under cover of darkness. Aristotle, the most learned man in the Greek world, abandons the city that never fully accepted him. For 13 years, the Lyceum has been his life, a school built in a grove sacred to Apollo, where students walk the covered walkways debating logic, ethics, the nature of the soul. Now the walkways stand empty. The students scatter, and their master slips away before dawn, one step ahead of an Athenian jury. The charge is impiety, asibeia, the same accusation that killed Socrates 77 years earlier. Prosecutors claim Aristotle wrote a hymn to his dead friend Hermias that treated a mortal man as a god, but everyone knows the real crime. Aristotle is Macedonian. Aristotle tutored Alexander, and Alexander, the conqueror who held Athens in his grip for over a decade, is dead. News of the death arrived months ago. Fever in Babylon. Alexander, 32 years old, master of the largest empire the world had ever seen, gone in a matter of days. The boy Aristotle once taught to love Homer, to dissect arguments, to observe nature with precision. That boy became a god king who conquered Persia, Egypt, and India. Now he is dust. With him dies every protection that shielded Macedonians in Athens. Mobs gather in the agora. Demosthenes, the great orator who spent decades warning against Macedonian tyranny, finds himself suddenly vindicated. Athenians want blood. They want to purge their city of Philip's legacy, of Alexander's shadow, of anyone carrying the stain of northern influence. Aristotle's own nephew Callisthenes already died at Alexander's hands, executed for refusing to prostrate before the king. Now Athens will finish what Alexander started. Aristotle could stay. Standing trial, as Socrates did, remains an option. A defence speech before the jury, trust in Athenian justice, acceptance of whatever verdict follows. But Aristotle has spent years studying constitutions, analysing how democracies turn against their own citizens, documenting the mechanisms of political revenge. Athenian juries respond to passion, not evidence. The outcome is already written. Besides, Aristotle knows exactly what hemlock does to a body. The numbness beginning in the feet, the paralysis climbing slowly toward the heart, the consciousness persisting almost to the end. These details fill his biological writings, observations recorded with clinical precision. Drinking that cup holds no mystery for him, only certainty. I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. The words reach his students as explanation and rebuke. Aristotle gathers what he can carry. Decades of manuscripts must stay behind. Treatises on logic, physics, biology, metaphysics, ethics, politics, poetry, rhetoric. The Lyceum passes to Theophrastus, his most trusted companion. Then Aristotle walks out of Athens for the last time, crosses to the island of Euboea, and retreats to Chalcis, his mother's hometown, exile. The word is familiar. 20 years earlier, when Plato died and the Academy chose Speusippus as successor, Aristotle faced the same choice. Passed over despite 2 decades of brilliant work, he wandered the Aegean for 12 years, studying marine life, teaching princes, waiting for Athens to want him back. Return finally came in 335 BC, a triumphant homecoming that produced the Lyceum and the most productive period of philosophical work in ancient history. Now that period ends, 62 years old, stomach churning with the illness that has plagued him for months, Aristotle finds himself back where he started, an outsider, a foreigner, a man whose ideas transformed human knowledge, reduced to hiding from an angry democracy. Some ancient sources whisper that the illness was no accident. Aconite, the poison called wolfsbane, induces symptoms matching Aristotle's final months. Perhaps the philosopher who catalogued toxins chose his own ending rather than wait for his body to fail. Other sources dismiss this as slander, insisting he died naturally, worn down by decades of relentless thought. The truth lies buried with him. Within a year of his flight, Aristotle is dead. The man who spent his life asking what makes a good life, who argued that happiness requires virtue, exercised over a complete lifetime, faces his own ending in exile. His school abandoned, his reputation under attack, his writings scattered. Is this a good life? Did Aristotle achieve eudaimonia, the flourishing he struggled for decades to define? To understand how the greatest mind of antiquity arrived at this bitter end, we must travel back 62 years to a small town on the northern edge of the Greek world, where a physician's son first learned that knowledge begins not with speculation, but with seeing. Before we begin this journey through one man's quest to understand everything, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Philosophy Archives. Your support means a great deal. Now settle in as we travel to ancient Stagira, to the childhood of the philosopher who would become the teacher of those who know. What would you risk to pursue truth? Your home, your safety, your life? Aristotle enters the world in 384 BC in Stagira, a small Greek colony clinging to the Chalcidic Peninsula, 300 miles north of Athens, frontier territory. The great city-states of the south, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, consider this region barely civilized, a backwater populated by farmers, fishermen and the occasional Greek settler trying to extract wealth from unforgiving land. To Athenian eyes, Stagira is provincial, peripheral, hardly worth noticing. Geography tells a different story. Stagira sits close to Macedon, the rising kingdom to the north, and this proximity will shape everything that follows. Aristotle's father Nicomachus serves as personal physician to King Amyntas III, grandfather of Alexander the Great. Court physician is no minor title. Greek doctors of this era stand among the most educated professionals alive, inheritors of the Hippocratic tradition that insists disease springs from natural causes rather than divine punishment. They observe symptoms, record cases, track outcomes, adjust treatments. They open bodies to understand what lies within. Young Aristotle grows up watching his father work. Before encountering Plato's dialogues, before hearing Socrates' name, before setting foot in any philosophical school, the boy learns a different kind of knowledge. Nicomachus shows him how to examine wounds, identify medicinal herbs, feel for the pulse at a patient's wrist. The household contains medical texts, treatises on anatomy, embryology, the progression of diseases. Jars hold preserved specimens. Instruments for cutting and probing rest on shelves. Empirical investigation surrounds Aristotle from his earliest years. This education diverges sharply from mainstream Greek philosophy. Most thinkers of the era distrust sensory experience. Pythagoreans seek truth in the abstract purity of numbers. Parmenides declares all change illusory. Plato, whom Aristotle will later study under, teaches that the physical world offers only shadows. True knowledge requires contemplating eternal forms invisible to any eye. Observation deceives. Reason alone reveals reality. But a physician's son learns otherwise. Nicomachus teaches that knowledge begins with looking carefully at particular things. A rash on skin, the colour of urine, the rhythm of breathing. Theory follows observation, not the reverse. This lesson will stay with Aristotle his entire life, distinguishing his philosophy from everyone who came before. Nicomachus provides something else equally valuable: access to power. As court physician, he moves through the halls of the Macedonian palace at Pella. Young Aristotle likely accompanies him on visits, witnessing a world utterly unlike the refined symposium culture of southern Greece. Macedonian nobles hunt, drink, fight, and scheme. Political murder is routine. 3 of King Amyntas' sons will die by violence. Power here is personal, unstable, and brutal. These observations surface decades later in Aristotle's political writings. Man is by nature a political animal, he will argue, incapable of flourishing outside community. Yet he will also analyse tyranny with chilling precision, documenting how regimes decay, how rulers lose legitimacy, how unchecked power corrupts. These are not abstract concerns for someone who watched Macedonian politics at close range. Then comes catastrophe. Sometime during Aristotle's childhood, the exact year remains uncertain. Both parents die. Nicomachus is gone. Mother Phaistis follows. The boy, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, becomes an orphan. Guardianship passes to a relative named Proxenus, who raises Aristotle in Atanius, a Greek city across the Aegean in Asia Minor. Almost nothing survives about these years. Ancient biographers hurry past the orphan's adolescence, eager to reach the dramatic arrival in Athens. But parental loss of this magnitude leaves marks. Aristotle's mature philosophy contains notably little sentimentality about death. The soul, he will argue, is simply the form of the body. Not a separate substance that survives physical destruction, not a prisoner escaping its cage, just the organising principle that makes a living thing what it is. When the body dies, the soul ends. No afterlife, no reincarnation, no mystical reunion with departed loved ones. Perhaps this cold clarity comes from a boy who buried both parents young and found no comfort in supernatural promises. At 17, Aristotle makes a choice that will redirect the course of Western thought. Leaving Athens behind, he travels south to the city that considers itself civilization's centre. Athens awaits, magnificent, arrogant, intellectually electric. And within Athens stands the Academy, Plato's school, the most prestigious institution of higher learning in the Greek world. What pulls him there? The sources offer no explanation. Perhaps Proxenus encourages the journey. Perhaps Plato's fame reaches even to Asia Minor. Perhaps a young man's restless hunger for answers simply demands more than any provincial town can provide. Whatever the reason, Aristotle arrives in Athens in 367 BC, 17 years old, a physician's son from the northern frontier, an orphan with no family connections in the city. Walking through the Academy's gates, he enters a world of ideas that will consume the next 2 decades of his life. The master waiting inside is 60 years old, the most famous philosopher alive, author of dialogues that have already begun reshaping Greek thought. Plato has no idea that the foreign teenager standing before him will one day surpass everything he built. What shapes a mind? The lessons we're taught or the losses we survive? The Academy lies about a mile northwest of Athens' walls, in a grove sacred to the hero Academus. Olive trees shade the paths, a gymnasium offers space for physical training, students gather in clusters, walking and talking, or sit in informal circles listening to lectures. There are no grand buildings yet, no institutional architecture. Philosophy happens outdoors, in conversation, under open sky. Plato founded this school around 387 BC. 40 years after Socrates' execution shattered his faith in Athenian politics. The Academy represents his answer to that trauma, not engagement with corrupt democracy, but withdrawal into a community dedicated to truth. Here, young men from across the Greek world receive the education that might someday produce philosopher kings capable of ruling justly. Into this community walks Aristotle in 367 BC, 17 years old, Macedonian accent marking him immediately as an outsider. Athens in this period harbours deep suspicion of the northern kingdoms. Macedonians are considered semi-barbarian, Greek in language but not truly civilized. Their kings practice polygamy. Their nobles settle disputes through assassination. They lack the refined culture that Athenians consider essential to genuine humanity. For a Macedonian teenager to enter the Academy, Plato's inner circle, the intellectual heart of Greek civilization, requires either extraordinary talent or extraordinary presumption. Aristotle possesses both. Within months, he earns a nickname, the Reader. Books in ancient Greece are rare, expensive, laboriously copied by hand onto papyrus scrolls. Most education happens orally. Students listen to lectures, memorize arguments, debate face to face. Reading is secondary, almost eccentric. But Aristotle reads voraciously, building a personal library that becomes famous throughout Athens. Later sources claim he is among the first private citizens to collect books systematically. The nickname carries a slight edge of mockery. True, philosophers think they don't merely read, but Aristotle's appetite for texts reflects something deeper than pedantry. A physician's son understands that knowledge accumulates across generations. Medical treatises preserve observations from Hippocrates and his successors. Consulting them is not weakness, but wisdom. Why should philosophy be different? Plato himself recognizes the young foreigner's brilliance. According to later tradition, he calls Aristotle the mind of the school, nous in Greek, the term for intellect itself. Another reported nickname is less flattering, the foal, a young horse that kicks. The implication is clear. This student will not simply absorb doctrine, he will challenge it. For 20 years, Aristotle remains at the Academy. 2 decades of lectures, debates and writing. He produces dialogues in Plato's style, now almost entirely lost, praised in antiquity for their eloquence. He studies mathematics, astronomy, dialectic, the full curriculum Plato. considers essential for philosophical development. According to the Academy's vision, students must master geometry and abstract reasoning before approaching the highest questions. The mind requires training, discipline, purification from the illusions of sense experience. Aristotle absorbs this education while quietly resisting its foundations. Plato teaches that true reality consists of eternal, unchanging forms, perfect templates, of which physical objects are mere imperfect copies. The form of beauty makes beautiful things beautiful. The form of justice defines what justice truly is. These forms exist in a realm beyond space and time, accessible only through reason, never through the senses. The physician's son finds this troubling. Where exactly do these forms exist? How do physical objects participate in them? If the form of horse explains what horses are, does there need to be a form of the form of horse, and so on infinitely? These objections bubble up during academy, debates, sharpening over years into systematic critique. Yet Aristotle does not leave. Whatever his disagreements, the Academy offers something unavailable anywhere else: a community of brilliant minds taking ideas seriously. Plato's school attracts the finest thinkers of the generation. Arguments are tested ruthlessly. Weak reasoning collapses under scrutiny. For an intellectually voracious young man, this environment is irreplaceable. The relationship between Aristotle and Plato remains mysterious. Ancient sources offer contradictory portraits. Some depict warm mutual respect between master and student. Others suggest tension, even hostility, with Plato frustrated by Aristotle's relentless questioning. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Plato recognized genius even when it challenged his own positions. Aristotle revered his teacher, while refusing to accept claims on authority alone. One line attributed to Aristotle captures the balance. Plato is dear to me, but truth is dearer. Whether he actually spoke these words remains uncertain, but they express something genuine about his philosophical temperament. Loyalty to persons matters less than loyalty to reality. Even the greatest teacher can be wrong. 20 years pass in this ferment of ideas. Aristotle enters the Academy as a teenager and emerges in middle age, his own philosophical vision taking shape beneath the surface. Then, in 347 BC, everything changes. Plato dies. 80 years old, the founder of Western philosophy's greatest school is gone. The Academy must choose a successor. Aristotle, the most brilliant mind in the institution, the reader, the intellect itself, surely the obvious choice. The Academy chooses Speusippus, Plato's nephew. When the door closes on everything you've built, you break it down or walk away. The choice of Speusippus stings. 20 years of work, 2 decades as the Academy's finest mind, and the position passes to a man whose primary qualification is blood relation to the founder. Speusippus is competent but uninspired, a loyal Platonist who will preserve orthodoxy rather than advance it. The message to Aristotle is clear: foreigners do not lead Athenian institutions. Brilliance matters less than belonging. Later apologists tried to soften the rejection. Perhaps Aristotle chose to leave voluntarily, eager to develop his own philosophy free from Platonic constraints. Perhaps the Academy's mathematical turn under Speusippus simply bored him. Perhaps he saw opportunities elsewhere that Athens could not provide. The explanations ring hollow. Aristotle devoted 20 years to the Academy. Walking away from everything he built, from students and colleagues and decades of accumulated work, from the only intellectual community that matched his abilities. This is not liberation. This is exile. Yet exile opens unexpected doors. Aristotle crosses the Aegean to Assos, a small city on the coast of Asia Minor, where a former Academy student named Hermias has risen to power. Hermias began life as a slave, somehow educated himself in philosophy, and through a combination of cunning and ruthlessness became tyrant of Atarneus and Assos. His court attracts philosophical talent, men interested in testing whether Platonic political theory might actually work in practice. Here is Aristotle's first encounter with real power since childhood visits to the Macedonian court. Hermias rules a small territory, but he rules absolutely. No democratic assembly constrains him. No traditional aristocracy limits his authority. He can implement whatever policies philosophy recommends. The experiment proves instructive. Hermias governs reasonably well by the standards of Greek tyrants, avoiding the worst cruelties, maintaining order, supporting intellectual activity. Aristotle, observes, advises, takes notes. But the arrangement also reveals limitations. Hermias depends on Persian tolerance for his independence. His power rests on military force, not philosophical legitimacy. When Persia eventually moves against him, no amount of wisdom will save his throne. Something else happens in Assos that ancient sources treat with unusual delicacy. Aristotle meets Pythias, Hermias' adopted daughter or niece. The relationship is unclear. They marry. In a philosophical culture that often treats women as intellectually negligible, Aristotle's relationship with Pythias stands out. When she dies years later, he requests in his will to have her bones buried beside his own. Whatever else their marriage involved, affection seems genuine. Hermias arranges for Aristotle and Pythias to move to Lesbos, the large island nearby, where research conditions prove ideal for a different kind of study. The lagoon of Pyrrha offers extraordinary marine biodiversity. Creatures, unavailable in landlocked Athens, swim in these waters. Cuttlefish, octopi, sea urchins, dozens of fish species. For a philosopher trained by a physician to trust observation over speculation, this environment is paradise. Aristotle begins dissecting. The scope of his biological research at Lesbos defies easy summary. Over the next several years he examines over 500 animal species. He opens cuttlefish to study their ink sacs. He traces the digestive systems of sea urchins. He observes the mating habits of octopi, the development of chick embryos, the social organisation of bees. No Greek philosopher has ever worked like this. Hands bloody, specimens arrayed on tables, observations recorded with painstaking precision. The results fill treatises that will dominate biological science for 2,000 years. Historia Animalium catalogues animal diversity with unprecedented thoroughness. Parts of Animals explains anatomy through function. Generation of Animals traces reproduction across species. These works establish comparative biology as a discipline, develop classification systems still recognizable today, and demonstrate that rigorous knowledge of nature requires looking at nature rather than theorizing from armchairs. Plato pointed upward toward eternal forms. Aristotle points at the dissection table. The contrast defines a split in Western thought that persists to the present. But why marine biology? Why spend years cutting open sea creatures when the great questions of philosophy await? The answer reveals something essential about Aristotle's method. Start with what you can observe. Build knowledge from particulars toward generals, not the reverse. If you want to understand what makes living things alive, you must examine living things, as many as possible, in as much detail as patience allows. Only then can patterns emerge. Only then can theory rest on something solid. This inversion of Platonic method will eventually reshape every field Aristotle touches. Ethics will begin with how people actually live, not with ideal forms of the good. Politics will analyse real constitutions, not imagine perfect cities. Physics will study how objects actually move, not deduce motion from abstract principles. The physician's son, exiled from Athens, covered in fish blood on a Greek island, is laying foundations that will outlast empires. Then a messenger arrives from Macedon. King Philip II has a problem. His son Alexander is 13 years old, brilliant and uncontrollable. The boy needs a tutor. Philip wants the finest mind in Greece. He wants Aristotle. What transforms a thinker into a teacher? Ambition, duty, or the chance to shape history? Before answering Philip's summons, Aristotle completes work that will define scientific method for 2 millennia. The lagoon at Lesbos becomes his laboratory. Fishermen bring specimens, assistants take dictation. Day after day, the philosopher cuts, observes, and records. Nothing in prior Greek thought prepares for this. Natural philosophy exists, certainly. Thales speculated that water underlies all matter. Empedocles proposed 4 elements. Democritus imagined invisible atoms. But these thinkers work from intuition and logic, constructing theories that require no actual investigation of nature. Aristotle does something radically different. He looks. Consider the cuttlefish. Prior accounts describe it vaguely, if at all. Aristotle dissects dozens of specimens, mapping internal structures with precision that will not be surpassed until the Renaissance. He identifies the ink sac correctly, notes its defensive function, describes how the animal propels itself through water. He observes. The cuttlefish have 8 arms plus 2 longer tentacles, a distinction earlier writers missed. He documents mating behaviour, egg-laying patterns, seasonal movements. One species of cuttlefish yields one treatise's worth of observations. Multiply this across 500 species and the scale of the project emerges. The method follows consistent principles. Begin with observation of particulars, group similar organisms together, identify shared features that distinguish groups from each other. Ask why these features exist. What function do they serve? Trace how organisms develop from embryo to adult. Compare structures across species to understand how nature solves similar problems differently. This is empirical science, not perfect by modern standards. Aristotle makes errors, accepts second-hand reports too readily, sometimes lets theory override evidence. But the fundamental commitment to observation, classification, and functional explanation establishes a template that working scientists still recognise. Certain discoveries still astonish modern biologists. Aristotle correctly describes the reproductive biology of the dogfish, a small shark species. The embryo develops inside the mother, attached by a structure resembling a mammalian placenta. This finding was dismissed as error for centuries, since sharks lay eggs. Only in the 19th century did researchers confirm that some shark species are indeed viviparous, giving live birth exactly as Aristotle described. How did he know? Simple. He dissected pregnant dogfish and looked inside. The chick embryo receives similar treatment. Aristotle opens fertilized eggs at successive stages of development, documenting the emergence of the heart, the formation of blood vessels, the differentiation of organs. His description of the heart as the first organ to develop and the last to die becomes standard biological doctrine. The methodology, examining developmental sequences to understand organic structure, that anticipates embryology as a formal discipline. Then there are the bees. Aristotle devotes extraordinary attention to hive organization, worker behavior, honey production, and the mysterious figure he calls the king. Actually the queen, though he notes confusion on this point. His observations of bee communication, waggle dances, and collective decision-making anticipate research that will earn a Nobel Prize in the 20th century. Why does nature fascinate him so completely? The philosophical answer emerges in his theoretical writings. Every natural object has a telos, an end, a purpose, a that for the sake of which it exists. The eye exists for seeing, wings exist for flying. Understanding any organic structure means grasping its function, its role in the creature's complete way of life. This teleological thinking distinguishes Aristotle from modern evolutionary biology, which explains adaptation through natural selection rather than inherent purpose, but it also enables his research program. Asking, "What is this for?" drives investigation forward, generates hypotheses, focuses observation. A modern biologist might phrase the question differently. What selective pressure favoured this trait? But the impulse to seek functional explanation remains. The deeper motivation may be personal. A physician's son learns early that bodies have meaning. Organs serve purposes, structures enable functions. Disease represents dysfunction, parts failing to perform their proper work. Healing means restoration of natural activity. This framework, absorbed in childhood, expands at Lesbos to encompass the entire living world. Aristotle also develops classification principles that will endure for centuries. Animals divide into those with blood and those without, roughly corresponding to vertebrates and invertebrates. Blooded animals subdivide into those that bear live young versus those that lay eggs, those that breathe air versus those that extract oxygen from water. The categories are imperfect but workable, providing structure for organising biological diversity. One question haunts the research. What makes living things alive? Inanimate objects exist but do not grow, reproduce, or pursue goals. Plants grow and reproduce but lack perception and movement. Animals perceive and move but vary enormously in cognitive capacity. Humans alone reason abstractly, contemplate universals, and ask philosophical questions. The answer will come later, in De Anima, on the soul. But the biological work prepares it. Soul for Aristotle is not a ghostly substance inhabiting the body like a tenant occupying a house. Soul is the form of a living body, the organisational principle that makes organic matter into a functioning organism. Different kinds of souls enable different capacities. Nutritive soul enables growth and reproduction. Sensitive soul enables perception and movement. Rational soul enables thought. When the body dies, its soul ends. No survival, no afterlife, no transmigration into new forms. The psyche is not immortal. This conclusion, stark and unsentimental, flows directly from biological observation. Watch enough creatures die under your scalpel and mystical theories of soul become difficult to maintain. Years pass in this labour. Pythias bears a daughter, also named Pythias. The household settles into rhythms of research, writing, and domestic life. Exile, which began as rejection, transforms into opportunity. Away from Athens, away from the Academy's orthodoxies, Aristotle develops a philosophical method entirely his own. Then the summons from Macedon arrives, and everything changes again. Philip II wants the finest philosopher in Greece to educate his son. The king offers resources, prestige, and something rarer still, the chance to shape a future ruler's mind. Aristotle packs his specimens, gathers his notes, and travels north to meet the most famous student in history. A 13-year-old boy, named Alexander, is waiting. Does knowledge change the world, or does power merely use it? Philip II of Macedon is not a man who does things halfway. When he decides his son needs education, he does not hire a local schoolmaster or summon some competent rhetorician from a nearby city. He sends for Aristotle, the most brilliant philosopher alive, and offers terms no scholar could refuse. The year is 343 BC. Aristotle is 41, settled into productive research at Lesbos, finally free from the Academy's shadow. Philip's invitation disrupts everything, but it also offers something unprecedented, a chance to test whether philosophy can actually shape political power. Philip himself is a remarkable figure. Rising from chaos after his older brothers died violently, he transformed Macedon from a backward kingdom into the dominant military force in Greece. His infantry phalanx wielding 18-foot sarissa spears crushes traditional hoplite formations. His diplomacy combines bribery, marriage alliances, and calculated brutality. Athens, Thebes, Sparta, the great powers, that once dismissed Macedon as semi-barbaric, now scramble to resist its expansion. The king wants his heir prepared for what is coming. Alexander is 13, already showing the brilliance and volatility that will define his life. He loves Homer, memorizing vast stretches of the Iliad, identifying with Achilles' rage and glory. He breaks horses that terrify grown men. The famous Bucephalus, purchased by Philip after Alexander alone recognized that the animal feared its own shadow. He burns to prove himself in battle, resents his father's successes, and chafes under any constraint. This is the student Aristotle must teach. Philip establishes them at Mieza, a quiet sanctuary away from the court's intrigues. Gardens and colonnades provide space for walking and discussion. A small group of noble boys joins Alexander, companions who will later become his generals and governors. Aristotle has 3 years to shape minds that will reshape the world. What does he teach them? The sources, offer fragments. Homer, certainly. Aristotle prepares a special edition of the Iliad that Alexander will carry on campaigns to the ends of the earth, sleeping with it under his pillow beside a dagger. Medicine and biology, drawing on Nicomachus's legacy and Aristotle's own research. Political theory, including analysis of constitutions and the conditions for stable rule. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion essential for any leader. Perhaps ethics, though whether Alexander absorbed those lessons remains debatable. One anecdote captures the relationship's complexity. Alexander writes to Aristotle years later, complaining that the philosopher has published certain teachings. Knowledge shared with everyone loses its value, Alexander argues. What distinguishes rulers from common people if not access to superior understanding? Aristotle's reported response is telling. The doctrines are published and yet not published. Anyone can read them, but only those properly prepared can understand them. Philosophy is not a secret to be hoarded, but a discipline requiring years of training to master. Publication threatens nothing, because comprehension demands effort that most people will never invest. The exchange reveals divergent values beneath the surface cooperation. Alexander wants knowledge as power, a weapon conferring advantage over rivals. Aristotle sees knowledge as its own end, valuable because true, properly pursued for understanding rather than domination. Teacher and student share 3 years at Mieza, but they inhabit different mental worlds. Other tensions emerge later. Aristotle teaches that the Greek city-state represents the highest form of political organization. that Greeks are naturally suited to freedom while barbarians are naturally suited to slavery. Alexander will conquer the largest empire in history and attempt to fuse Greek and Persian cultures, marrying Eastern princesses, adopting Persian court customs, demanding prostration from subjects. Nothing, in Aristotle's Politics, prepares for or endorses this universalism. Did the teaching fail, or did Alexander simply outgrow his teacher's categories, encountering realities that parochial Greek philosophy could not comprehend? The question has no clear answer. What seems certain is that 3 years at Mysa did not produce a philosopher king in any sense Plato would recognise. But Aristotle gained something too. Proximity to power clarifies its nature. Philip's court demonstrates how states actually function, through military strength, economic resources, strategic marriage, and carefully managed succession. The ideal cities of Platonic dialogue bear little resemblance to Macedonian reality. When Aristotle later writes his Politics, empirical observation of how regimes work replaces utopian speculation about how they should be designed. In 340 BC, Philip recalls Alexander to court. The boy is 16, ready for military responsibility. Aristotle's formal role as tutor ends, though. Correspondence continues for years. The philosopher remains in Macedon for a time, perhaps continuing research, perhaps advising Philip on Greek affairs. Then events accelerate beyond anyone's control. Philip is assassinated in 336 BC, stabbed by a bodyguard during his daughter's wedding celebration. Alexander, 20 years old, seizes the throne, eliminates rivals, and prepares to fulfill his father's plan: invasion of the Persian Empire. Within 2 years, he crosses into Asia. Within 10, he reaches India. He will never return to Greece alive. Aristotle watches his former student conquer the world from an increasing distance. The relationship that began at Mysa grows strained, complicated by politics, divergent ambitions, and eventually tragedy. But that reckoning lies ahead. For now, with Philip dead and Alexander marching east, Aristotle faces a choice. He is 50 years old. The academy remains under Speusippus's control. Macedon no longer needs him. The biological research continues, but isolation on Aegean islands offers no audience, no students, no legacy. If Aristotle wants to build something lasting, he must return to the city that rejected him. Athens awaits, suspicious as ever of Macedonians, but weakened by Philip's victories and now subject to Alexander's power. The moment for founding a rival school has finally arrived. Can you teach wisdom to the powerful, or does power corrupt every lesson? Understanding Aristotle's philosophy requires starting where he insisted all inquiry must start, with the tools of thought itself. Before investigating nature, ethics, or politics, we need reliable methods for reasoning correctly. False conclusions follow from faulty logic, no matter how brilliant the thinker. The organon, meaning instrument, provides the equipment every philosopher requires. Imagine Aristotle lecturing in the Lyceum's covered walkways. Students pace beside him, styluses ready to scratch notes into wax tablets. The subject is deceptively simple. What makes an argument valid? Prior thinkers approached this question haphazardly. Socrates refuted opponents by exposing contradictions, but he never systematized the method. Plato's dialogues demonstrate brilliant argumentation without explaining its underlying structure. Sophists taught persuasive techniques, caring more about winning debates than reaching truth. Aristotle aims for something different, a science of reasoning itself. The syllogism forms the core of his system. A syllogism consists of two premises and a conclusion. If the premises are true and properly connected, the conclusion follows necessarily. All mammals are warm-blooded, all dogs are mammals, therefore all dogs are warm-blooded. The conclusion cannot be false if the premises are true. Logic guarantees the inference. This seems obvious now, so familiar that its revolutionary character disappears, but Aristotle is the first thinker in history to analyse argument structure formally, abstracting from specific content to examine patterns of inference. He categorises syllogisms by figure and mood, identifies which combinations yield valid conclusions, and demonstrates which forms guarantee truth preservation. The system has limits. Syllogistic logic handles categorical statements, all, some, none, but struggles with relational reasoning and mathematical proof. Modern symbolic logic developed in the 19th and 20th centuries vastly extends the formal apparatus. But for 2,000 years, Aristotle's syllogistic remained the gold standard for rigorous argumentation. Beyond formal validity lies a deeper question. Where do premises come from? Valid arguments can reach false conclusions if their premises are false. All fish are mammals, all salmon are fish, therefore all salmon are mammals. The logic is impeccable. The conclusion is wrong because the first premise is false. Sound reasoning requires not just valid inference but true starting points. Aristotle distinguishes demonstrative knowledge from dialectical argument. Demonstration begins from first principles, foundational truths that cannot themselves be demonstrated but are known through intellectual intuition or induction from experience. From these principles, rigorous deduction derives further truths. The model is geometry. Starting from axioms and definitions, mathematicians prove theorems with certainty. But how do we reach first principles? Here Aristotle parts company with Plato. There is no mystical recollection of truths the soul knew before birth. First principles emerge from accumulated experience. We observe many particular instances, recognize patterns, and abstract general truths. Seeing many white swans, we form the concept swan, and the generalization swans are white. The process is fallible. Black swans may lurk undiscovered, but it is how actual human knowledge develops. Dialectic serves a different function. Where demonstration proceeds from established truths, dialectic examines opinions, tests assumptions, and clears away confusion. The Socratic method belongs here, questioning interlocutors, exposing contradictions, refining initial beliefs through critical examination. Dialectic does not produce certain knowledge, but prepares the ground for it. The categories, another component of the organon, analyzes the basic types of things that can be said about reality. Substance is primary, individual things like Socrates or this particular horse. Everything else depends on substance, qualities, quantities, relations, places, times, positions, states, actions, and affections. Asking what exists ultimately means asking what substances exist and what can be truly predicated of them. These logical and metaphysical foundations shape everything that follows. When Aristotle investigates nature, he asks what kinds of substances exist in the physical world and what can be demonstrated about them. When he examines ethics, he asks what can be truly said about human action and the good life. When he analyzes politics, he classifies constitutions and identifies which forms best achieve their purposes. The organon makes systematic philosophy possible. Without reliable methods for distinguishing valid from invalid reasoning, true from false premises, investigation collapses into mere opinion. Aristotle's tools do not guarantee reaching truth. That requires empirical observation and intellectual insight, but they prevent the grosser errors that careless thinking produces. Generations of students learned these techniques. Medieval universities made the organon foundational to all advanced study. Mastering logic preceded study of theology, law, or medicine. The trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, trained minds to read carefully, reason correctly, and argue persuasively. Aristotelian logic, whatever its technical limitations, provided intellectual discipline that shaped Western education for centuries. Modern philosophy and science have moved beyond the organon in various ways. Symbolic logic handles complexities syllogistic cannot. Scientific method incorporates experimental testing that Aristotle never developed. Probability theory addresses uncertainty in ways categorical logic does not. But the fundamental insight remains. Careful thinking requires attention to the structure of arguments, not just their content. The tools are now in hand. What does Aristotle build with them? Everything. The entire structure of reality, from physics to metaphysics, from biology to ethics. The construction begins with the world around us, the natural order that Aristotle observed so closely at Lesbos. Nature operates for purposes. Understanding those purposes unlocks understanding itself. What distinguishes genuine knowledge from confident opinion? And how can we tell the difference? Step outside the Lyceum's colonnades and observe the world. Leaves fall from trees, rain descends from clouds, animals hunt, mate, and die. The physical world surrounds us, obvious and familiar. But what explains it? Why do things happen as they do? What makes nature intelligible? Plato's answer pointed beyond the physical. material objects are shadows, imperfect copies of eternal forms. Understanding reality means escaping the sensory world for pure reason's domain. The philosopher turns away from flux toward permanence, from particular things toward universal templates. Aristotle turns back. The physical world is not shadow, but substance. Understanding nature means investigating nature, carefully, systematically, without shortcuts to transcendent realms. This is what the biological research at Lesbos taught him. Truth lies in the particular, the observable, the concrete. But observation alone does not yield understanding. Seeing leaves fall tells us leaves fall. It does not. Explain why. Aristotle's genius lies in developing explanatory frameworks that make sense of natural phenomena without abandoning them for abstractions. The doctrine of four causes structures all his natural philosophy. Every natural process, every existing thing can be explained by identifying four distinct factors. Material cause answers, what is it made of? A bronze statue's material cause is bronze. A living body's material cause is flesh, bone, blood, and organs. The material constrains possibilities. You cannot make a functioning sword from wax or a living creature from stone. Formal cause answers, what makes it what it is? The statue's formal cause is its shape, the configuration that makes this lump of bronze a statue of Athena rather than a formless mass. For living things, formal cause is more complex. The soul, which for Aristotle means the organising principle that makes a body a living organism rather than a corpse. Efficient cause answers what brought it about. The sculptor's action is the statue's efficient cause. The father's seed is the efficient cause of offspring. This comes closest to modern notions of causation, the event or agent that produces an effect. Final cause answers, what is it for? The statue exists for worship, commemoration, or decoration. The eye exists for seeing. The heart exists for pumping blood. Final causation, teleology, pervades Aristotelian nature. Everything has a purpose, an end toward which it naturally moves. Modern science largely abandoned final causes. Physics explains motion through forces and initial conditions, not purposes. Biology explains adaptation through natural selection, not inherent goals. Teleology seems to import consciousness into unconscious processes, as if nature had intentions. But Aristotle is more subtle than this objection suggests. He does not claim that acorns consciously intend to become oak trees. Rather, understanding what an acorn is requires understanding what it naturally develops into. The oak is implicit in the acorn, not as conscious plan but as natural trajectory. Explaining organic structure requires reference to function. You cannot understand the eye without understanding seeing. This insight survives in contemporary biology. Biologists constantly invoke function when explaining organs, behaviours, and developmental processes. The language of adaptation, fitness, and selection substitutes for Aristotle's teleology, but preserves its explanatory power. Why do birds have wings? To fly. Why does camouflage exist? For concealment. Functional explanation remains indispensable. Aristotle's physics proper, his account of motion, place, time, and change, proved less durable. Objects move naturally toward their proper places, earth downward, fire upward, celestial bodies in circles. Heavy objects fall faster than light ones. Void is impossible. Space is always filled with substance. These claims, based on everyday observation rather than controlled experiment, crumble under Galilean and Newtonian scrutiny. Yet even failed theories reveal method. Aristotle asks questions about motion that earlier thinkers ignored or assumed away. What is motion? Change from potentiality to actuality. What is place? The inner boundary of the containing body. What is time? The measure of motion with respect to before and after. These analyses, however inadequate physically, establish conceptual frameworks for addressing problems systematically. The distinction between potentiality and actuality pervades his entire system. An acorn is potentially an oak. A block of marble is potentially a statue. A student is potentially a master. Actuality is prior to potentiality. The oak explains what the acorn is, not the reverse. Development moves from less to more actual, from indeterminate to determinate, from unformed matter toward realized form. This metaphysical picture grounds the biological observations from Lesbos. Living things develop toward mature form. Seeds become plants. Embryos become adults. The developmental trajectory defines the organism's nature. What a thing most truly is appears in its fullest realization, not its earlier stages. Nature does nothing in vain. This principle guides Aristotle's biological investigations. If a structure exists, it serves a purpose. If a behaviour occurs, it has a function. Apparent exceptions demand explanation. Vestigial organs, developmental anomalies, monsters born with missing parts. These are failures, nature missing its mark, not evidence against teleological order. The cosmos itself exhibits purposive structure. Below the moon lies the sublunary realm, earth, water, air, fire, where change and decay prevail. Above lies the celestial realm, perfect, eternal, moving in circles. The unmoved mover, which we will examine shortly, stands at the apex, pure actuality toward which all nature strives. This vision unifies physics, biology, and theology into a coherent whole. Modern science fragments this unity, treating physics, biology, and religion as separate domains with different methods and standards. But Aristotle's integration, however scientifically outdated, represents an intellectual achievement of staggering ambition, the attempt to explain everything within a single framework. The framework rests on observation. That is its enduring legacy. Look at nature. Describe what you see. Ask what it is for. Build explanation from evidence, not from speculation alone. This method, more than any specific doctrine, makes Aristotle the ancestor of empirical science. Does nature truly have purposes, or do we merely project our own intentions onto an indifferent universe? Philosophy descends from the heavens. After unmoved movers and cosmic causation, Aristotle turns to the question that matters most for actual human beings. How should we live? What makes a life worth living? What is happiness, and how do we achieve it? The Nicomachean Ethics, named for Aristotle's son Nicomachus, who may have edited the text, opens with a deceptively simple observation. Every action aims at some good. We eat to satisfy hunger. We work to earn money. We earn money to buy necessities. We buy necessities to live comfortably. But this chain of purposes must terminate somewhere. There must be some final good, pursued for its own sake, that gives point to everything else. That final good, Aristotle argues, is eudaimonia. The word is often translated as happiness, but this misleads modern readers. Happiness in contemporary English suggests a feeling, pleasant emotions, subjective satisfaction, the warm glow of contentment. Eudaimonia means something different. It refers to living well and doing well, to flourishing across a complete lifetime, to fulfilling one's nature as a human being. You cannot achieve eudaimonia in a moment or lose it through a bad mood. It is not how you feel, but how you live. What does living well require? Here Aristotle's method becomes distinctive. He does not deduce the good life from abstract principles, or derive it from a form of the good shimmering in some transcendent realm. Instead, he examines how people actually talk about happiness, what they consider admirable, what they praise and blame. Philosophy begins with common opinions, refines them through critical analysis, and arrives at conclusions that preserve what is sound while discarding what is confused. Common opinion identifies several candidates for the good life. Some say pleasure, the life devoted to bodily enjoyment and sensory gratification. But this reduces humans to the level of cattle, ignoring what distinguishes us from animals. Others say honour, recognition by the community, political success, public esteem. But honour depends on those who bestow it rather than on the honoured person. It makes happiness hostage to others' judgments. Still others say wealth, the accumulation of resources that enable all other pursuits. But wealth is obviously instrumental, valuable for what it buys rather than for itself. The good life must be self-sufficient, chosen for its own sake, and distinctively human. What activity meets these criteria? Aristotle's answer: the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue exercised over a complete lifetime. Unpack this carefully. Humans are rational animals. Our distinctive function, what we do that nothing else does, is to reason. Just as a good knife cuts well and a good eye sees clearly, a good human being reasons well. But reasoning well means reasoning virtuously. exercising the excellences that make rational activity flourish. Virtue, arete in Greek, does not mean prim moralism or rigid rule-following. It means excellence, the full development of a capacity. A virtuous person excels at being human the way a virtuous horse excels at being a horse. The virtues are those qualities that enable human flourishing: courage, temperance, justice, wisdom, generosity, proper pride, good temper, friendliness, truthfulness, wit. Each virtue occupies a mean between extremes. Courage stands between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity stands between stinginess and extravagance. Proper pride stands between vanity and self-deprecation. The mean is not mathematical average, but the right amount for this person in this situation. What a person of practical wisdom would determine. Practical wisdom, phronesis, emerges as the master virtue. Knowing what courage requires in a particular situation cannot be reduced to rules. Context matters. A soldier facing overwhelming odds must judge when standing firm is brave and when it is suicidal. A generous person must discern how much to give, to whom, on what occasions. No formula covers all cases. Practical wisdom is the trained capacity to perceive what virtue requires and act accordingly. How do we acquire virtue? Not by studying ethics texts. Virtue is a hexis, a stable disposition, developed through practice. We become courageous by performing courageous acts, temperate by practicing temperance, just by doing justice. Initially, we act virtuously through instruction and habituation, parents and teachers shaping behaviour before we understand why. Eventually, through repeated practice, virtuous action becomes second nature. The truly virtuous person enjoys acting well, finds pleasure in noble deeds, and is pained by base ones. This has educational implications. Character formation matters more than theoretical knowledge. A society that wants virtuous citizens must train them from childhood, habituating right action before rational reflection becomes possible. Laws, customs, and institutions shape character. Philosophy alone cannot make people good. Yet Aristotle insists on intellectual virtue alongside moral virtue. The highest human activity is contemplation, theoria, the exercise of our rational capacity on the most important truths. The contemplative life, devoted to philosophical and scientific understanding, represents the fullest human flourishing. This creates tension with the political life devoted to moral virtue and practical engagement. Are philosophers or statesmen happiest? Aristotle seems to favour contemplation as most divine, while acknowledging that most people will live politically rather than philosophically. External goods also matter. Eudaimonia requires not just virtue but adequate resources. Extreme poverty makes flourishing nearly impossible. Ugly appearance, lack of friends, loss of children through death. These misfortunes damage happiness even for virtuous people. Aristotle rejects Stoic claims that virtue alone suffices for the good life. We are embodied creatures in a social world. Our flourishing depends partly on circumstances beyond our control. This acknowledgement of moral luck distinguishes Aristotle from more rigorous ethical theories. Kant will argue that moral worth lies entirely in the goodwill, immune to external fortune. Utilitarians will locate value in outcomes that effort can influence. Aristotle accepts that good people can be unlucky, that lives can go badly through no fault of the person living them. Priam, king of Troy, flourished for decades before watching his city destroyed and his children killed. Was his life happy? The question has no easy answer. Friendship receives extensive treatment, filling 2 of the 10 books of the Nicomachean Ethics. Perfect friendship, based on mutual recognition of virtue rather than utility or pleasure, is essential to the good life. We need friends to exercise virtue toward, to share activities with, to help us know ourselves. The solitary life, however intellectually rich, remains incomplete. Humans are social. Animals. Flourishing requires community. The ethics points toward politics. Individual virtue develops within communities that train citizens properly. Bad cities produce bad people. Good cities produce good ones. If we want human flourishing, we must design institutions that make flourishing possible. Ethics and politics are continuous inquiries, the former examining individual character, the latter examining the communities where character forms. What begins as abstract question, how should we live, becomes practical guidance. Cultivate virtue through practice, seek practical wisdom for particular situations. build friendships based on mutual goodness, engage in contemplation as the highest activity, recognise that fortune matters but virtue matters more, live well across a complete lifetime, not just in moments of pleasure or achievement. Simple enough to state, difficult enough to require a lifetime of practice. Is happiness something we achieve through effort, or something fortune bestows and withdraws at will? Humans are not solitary creatures. We do not flourish in isolation, surviving alone in forests like beasts or existing self-sufficiently like gods. Our nature drives us toward community. We need others not just for survival, but for fulfillment. Without the city, virtue remains undeveloped, speech finds no audience, and the distinctively human capacities wither unused. This is what Aristotle means by calling humans zoon politikon, the political animal. The phrase does not merely observe that people live together. It claims that community is natural, that the city-state exists by nature rather than convention, that human flourishing is essentially social. The politics opens by tracing communities' origins. Individuals pair for reproduction, male and female producing offspring. Households form from pairs plus children plus slaves who provide necessary labour. Villages emerge when households cluster together for security and exchange. Finally, cities arise when villages unite into self-sufficient communities capable of enabling the good life. The city is natural because it completes a developmental trajectory, implicit in human sociality from the beginning. Just as the oak is implicit in the acorn, the polis is implicit in the household. Nature does nothing in vain. Our capacity for political life would not exist if political life were not our natural fulfillment. But cities vary enormously. Some are ruled by one, some by few, some by many. Some pursue the common good, others serve the ruler's private interests. Aristotle catalogues constitutional forms with the empirical thoroughness that characterises his biological work. He and his students collected 158 actual constitutions, analysing how different cities organise power, distribute citizenship, balance classes, and maintain stability. The classification distinguishes legitimate from deviant regimes. Legitimate constitutions aim at common benefit, deviant ones at ruler's advantage. Kingship, rule by one for the common good, degenerates into tyranny when the monarch serves only himself. Aristocracy, rule by virtuous few, degenerates into oligarchy when the wealthy few govern for their own enrichment. Polity, rule by the many for common benefit, degenerates into democracy when the poor majority pursues only its class interest. This terminology can confuse modern readers. For Aristotle, democracy is a deviant form, rule by the poor in their own interest, while polity names the legitimate version of popular government. Contemporary usage reverses this, treating democracy as the ideal. But Aristotle's underlying insight survives. Regimes can serve narrow interests or common goods, and this distinction matters more than who holds power. What constitution is best? Aristotle's answer is characteristically nuanced. In principle, aristocracy led by the genuinely virtuous would be ideal, but genuine virtue is rare, and claims to virtue masks self-interest. Practically, a mixed constitution combining elements of oligarchy and democracy offers the most stable arrangement. The middle class, neither extremely rich nor desperately poor, should predominate. Extremes of wealth and poverty generate faction. Moderate citizens have stakes in stability. Property arrangements receive extensive treatment. Plato's Republic proposed abolishing private property and family among the guardian class to prevent conflicts of interest. Aristotle objects forcefully. Private ownership encourages care for possessions that common ownership discourages. Family bonds provide emotional satisfaction essential for human happiness. The communist arrangements Plato imagines would dissolve the social ties that make political life meaningful. But unlimited accumulation is equally problematic. Wealth exists for use, not for hoarding. The pursuit of money without limit, what Aristotle calls crematistics as opposed to legitimate household management, corrupts character and destabilizes cities. Moderate property, privately owned but liberally shared, represents the sound position. Citizenship poses harder questions. Who belongs to the political community? Aristotle's answer excludes most residents of any actual Greek city. Women, slaves, resident aliens, manual labourers, none qualify. Citizens are free adult males who participate in deliberation and judgment, sharing in rule and being ruled in turn. This excludes perhaps 90% of the population from political standing. Modern readers recoil from these exclusions, especially the defence of slavery. Aristotle argues that some people are natural slaves, those whose rational capacity is sufficient to recognise reason in others, but insufficient for self-direction. Such people benefit from being ruled, just as bodies benefit from being ruled by souls. This argument fails by Aristotle's own standards. He acknowledges that actual slavery often captures the naturally free through war or misfortune, and he never demonstrates that natural slaves exist in significant numbers. The defence of slavery represents Aristotle's worst failure, rationalisation of existing injustice rather than critical examination of common opinion. The method that exposes confused thinking about happiness and virtue fails him here, perhaps because his own interests as a slave-owning householder cloud his judgment. Even great philosophers have blind spots. Women receive slightly better treatment, though hardly satisfactory. Aristotle acknowledges female rationality but considers it without authority, capable of judgment but naturally subordinate to male rule. Women belong in households, not assemblies. Their virtue lies in obedience, not leadership. Again, common opinion shapes conclusion rather than being critically examined. These failures should not obscure genuine insights. The analysis of constitutional forms, the attention to stability and faction, the recognition that regimes serve different class, interests, the emphasis on education in forming citizens. These contributions endure. Modern political science inherits Aristotle's empirical approach, even while rejecting his exclusions. The deepest insight may be the simplest. Politics is not merely necessary evil, a structure for restraining human badness. Politics is natural, an expression of human sociality, the context within which virtue develops and flourishing becomes possible. Good cities make good citizens make good cities. The reciprocal relationship between individual and community lies at the heart of Aristotle's vision. We do not choose whether to be political. We choose only what kind of politics we practice. Can a society be judged by whom it excludes from citizenship? And what would ours say about us? What is the soul? The question haunted Greek philosophy from its origins. Homer scattered souls as breath images that depart at death. Pythagoreans taught transmigration through multiple bodies. Plato argued for immortal souls trapped in material prisons, longing to escape to the realm of forms. Each view carries assumptions about human nature, death, and the good life. Aristotle's answer, developed in De Anima, on the soul, breaks decisively from these traditions. Soul is not a substance separate from body, not a ghost inhabiting a machine, not a prisoner awaiting release. Soul is the form of a living body, the organizational principle that makes organic matter alive rather than dead. Consider the difference between a living animal and a corpse. Materially, they might be identical, the same flesh, bone, and blood, at least initially. Yet one is alive, and the other is not. What distinguishes them? Not some added ingredient, some invisible vapour that departs at death. What distinguishes them is organisation, function, the capacity to perform living activities. The soul is this capacity, and not a thing, but a way of being. Aristotle defines soul as the first actuality of a natural body that has life potentially. Dense phrasing characteristic of his technical vocabulary, but the meaning clarifies through examples. A body has life potentially if it possesses the organic structure necessary for living activities: nutrition, growth, perception, movement, thought. The soul is the actualization of this potential, the being at work of the living body. An analogy helps. If an axe had a soul, its soul would be cutting. Not the blade, not the handle, not the material composition, but the function that makes an axe what it is. If an eye had a soul, its soul would be seeing, not the jelly and membrane, but the activity that defines the organ. Soul relates to body as function relates to structure. This view has radical implications for mortality. If soul is the form of the body rather than a separate substance, then soul cannot exist without body any more than cutting can exist without an axe. When the body dies, its soul ends. No afterlife, no reincarnation, no escape to higher realms. Death is termination, not transition. Aristotle does qualify this conclusion in puzzling ways. The active intellect, the capacity for abstract thought, may be separable, immortal, and eternal. But this active intellect is impersonal, not the individual soul that makes Socrates Socrates or you yourself. Personal identity does not survive death, even if something intellectual does. The immortality Aristotle entertains offers no comfort for those hoping to meet departed loved ones. Within the living being, souls come in types corresponding to different capacities. Plants possess nutritive soul, the capacity for growth, nutrition, and reproduction. Animals possess sensitive soul, the capacities of plants plus perception and locomotion. Humans possess rational soul, all animal capacities plus reason and abstract thought. Higher souls include the functions of lower ones. We digest food and perceive sensations as well as thinking philosophically. Perception receives detailed analysis. How do we see colours, hear sounds, smell odours? Aristotle rejects both pure materialism and Platonic dualism. Perception is neither merely physical change in organs nor immaterial soul-grasping forms. It is the capacity to receive sensible forms without matter. The eye takes on the form of red when seeing red things without becoming materially red. This account struggles with its own implications. What exactly does receiving form without matter mean? How does it differ from physical change in the sense organ? Aristotle's interpreters have debated these questions for centuries without consensus. The theory gestures towards something important. Perception involves more than mere physical causation, yet less than immaterial intuition, but never quite achieves clarity. Imagination and memory extend perception. We form images of things not presently perceived, recall past experiences, and combine memories into new configurations. Animals share these capacities to varying degrees. A dog remembers its master, anticipates food, and navigates familiar territory. These activities require no rational soul, only sensitive soul operating on retained perceptions. Thought is different. While perception grasps particulars, this red apple, that barking dog, thought grasps universals. We perceive individual triangles but think triangularity. We observe just acts but contemplate justice itself. This capacity for abstraction, for moving from particulars to universal truths, distinguishes rational from merely sensitive soul. The intellect has no organ. Perception requires eyes, ears, tongues, bodily structures that physically receive sensory forms, but thought thinks all forms whatsoever, including the forms of bodily things. If intellect had an organ, it could only receive certain forms determined by that organ's structure. Since intellect must be open to all forms, it cannot be limited by material constitution. It is, in Aristotle's phrase, nothing actual before it thinks, pure potentiality for all objects of thought. This creates tension with the hylomorphic view of soul as form of body. If intellect has no organ, how does it relate to the living body whose form soul is? Aristotle acknowledges the difficulty without resolving it. The intellect seems both part of soul and separate from it, both dependent on body and independent. Later commentators split over whether Aristotle teaches personal immortality through the intellect or only impersonal survival of some universal rational principle. Whatever the metaphysical puzzles, the psychological observations retain value. The analysis of perception, memory, imagination, and thought as distinct but related capacities anticipates later cognitive science. The insistence that soul and body form a unity rather than an uneasy alliance shapes subsequent debates about mind and brain. The rejection of Platonic dualism opens space for understanding mental life as natural rather than supernatural. What we are, on Aristotle's view, is neither pure spirit temporally embodied nor mere matter accidentally conscious. We are living beings whose distinctive activity is rational thought, whose souls are the forms of our bodies, whose flourishing requires exercising our capacities well. Psychology serves ethics. Understanding the soul helps us understand how to live. The soul's functions point toward their fulfillment. The eye's function is seeing. Fulfillment means seeing well. The soul's function is living. Fulfillment means living well. Philosophy of mind leads back to philosophy of life. If the soul is what the body does rather than what the body has, what implications follow for how we treat our bodies and ourselves? After logic, physics, metaphysics, ethics, and politics, Aristotle turns to art. The Poetics, fragmentary and densely argued, offers the first systematic philosophy of literature in Western history. Its influence on literary criticism, drama, and storytelling extends to the present day. The inquiry begins with imitation. All art is mimesis, representation, imitation, portrayal. Painters imitate through colour and form, musicians through rhythm and melody, poets through language. This might seem to make art mere copying, reproduction of what already exists, but Aristotle means something more interesting. Imitation involves selection, arrangement, and transformation. The artist does not merely transcribe reality, but shapes materials to produce particular effects. Tragedy serves as the central case study. Epic poetry and comedy receive briefer treatment. A promised analysis of comedy may have been lost or never written. Tragedy, for Aristotle, represents the highest poetic achievement, and understanding tragedy illuminates art's essential nature. The famous definition: tragedy is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with artistic ornaments, in the form of action, not narrative, achieving through pity and fear the catharsis of such emotions. Every phrase requires unpacking. The action must be serious, not trivial or comic, but weighted with significance. It must be complete, having beginning, middle, and end forming a unified whole. It must have magnitude, substantial enough to matter but bounded enough to comprehend. The language must be enhanced. Poetry, not prose, with rhythm and sometimes song. The form must be dramatic, characters acting, not a narrator describing. And the effect must be cathartic, producing emotional purgation through pity and fear. Catharsis remains Aristotle's most debated concept. The Greek word carries medical connotations: purgation, cleansing, evacuation. Does tragedy purge harmful emotions the way medicine purges harmful humours? If so, how? By expressing emotions we would otherwise repress. By experiencing emotions safely in aesthetic distance. By clarifying emotions through understanding their proper objects. Interpreters divide. Some emphasize emotional release. Tragedy provides safe outlet for feelings that would otherwise fester or explode. Others emphasize intellectual clarification. We understand pity and fear better through experiencing them in structured aesthetic contexts. Still others emphasize education. Tragedy teaches us what deserves pity and fear, refining emotional responses. Aristotle's terse comment supports multiple readings. What seems clear is that tragedy's emotional effect is beneficial, not harmful. Plato attacked poetry as dangerous, arousing passions that reason should control, feeding the appetitive soul at reason's expense. The ideal city of the Republic bans most poetry for corrupting citizens' characters. Aristotle responds that well-crafted tragedy does not corrupt but educates, not by suppressing emotion but by channeling it properly. The structure of tragedy receives precise analysis. Plot is the soul of tragedy, more important than character, thought, diction, melody, or spectacle. A well-constructed plot contains reversal, recognition, and suffering. Reversal, peripeteia, turns the action from one direction to its opposite. The messenger who comes to reassure Oedipus reveals the very thing that destroys him. Recognition, anagnorisis, shifts from ignorance to knowledge. Oedipus discovers his true identity. Suffering, pathos, is the destructive or painful action, the blinding, the death, the catastrophe. The best plots combine these elements causally. Events should follow necessarily or probably from preceding events, not arbitrarily or by coincidence. The unity Aristotle demands is not merely chronological but logical. What happens must be what would happen given the characters and situations involved. Random interventions by gods, the deus ex machina, represent artistic failure, resolving plots through external imposition rather than internal development. The tragic hero must be neither perfectly virtuous nor thoroughly villainous. A perfectly good person suffering misfortune produces outrage, not pity and fear. A bad person suffering deserved punishment produces satisfaction, not tragic emotion. Tragedy requires someone like ourselves, a person of intermediate moral standing, whose downfall results from hamartia, error, mistake, missing the mark. Hamartia is not moral fault in the sense of wickedness or vice. Oedipus does not deserve his fate. He acts in ignorance, trying to avoid the very prophecy he fulfills. The error lies in not knowing what he could not have known, in acting on incomplete information that leads to catastrophe. Tragedy shows how good intentions and noble character can still end in ruin, not through cosmic injustice, but through the limits of human knowledge and foresight. This concept has profound implications beyond literary criticism. The tragic worldview acknowledges that outcomes do not always match deserts, that moral seriousness cannot guarantee success, that living well requires luck as well as virtue. Aristotle's ethics already recognise this. The Poetics dramatises it. We pity the tragic hero because we recognise our own vulnerability. We fear because we see how easily we too might fall. Character, though secondary to plot, requires consistency and appropriateness. Characters should act as such, people would act, maintaining coherent personalities across the action. Even inconsistency, if characteristic of a person, should be consistently inconsistent. The characters must also be good, not morally perfect, but of sufficient stature that their downfall matters. Language should be clear but elevated. Overly obscure diction confuses, overly common diction lacks dignity. Metaphor demonstrates genius, the capacity to perceive similarity in dissimilar things. The best poets are those who make language do more than merely convey information, who use words to illuminate, surprise, and move. The Poetics treats poetry as a craft with identifiable principles. Good tragedy is not mysterious inspiration, but skilled construction. Understanding the principles allows both creation of better works and appreciation of existing ones. Criticism becomes possible once we know what tragedy aims at and what techniques serve that aim. This approach, analysing art through effects and techniques, founds Western literary criticism. Subsequent theorists accept, modify, or reject Aristotle's categories, but they cannot ignore them. The unities of action, time, and place that neoclassical critics derived, not entirely accurately, from the Poetics-dominated drama for centuries. The concept of hamartia shapes how we discuss tragic heroes from Macbeth to Willy Loman. The debate over catharsis continues in discussions of violence in media and emotional effects of art. Aristotle grants art serious philosophical attention. Poetry is not mere entertainment or dangerous distraction, but a distinctive way of understanding human life. Through imitation, selection, and arrangement, artists illuminate aspects of reality that philosophy approaches differently. Ethics tells us how to live. Tragedy shows us how lives can go wrong despite, or because of, our best efforts. What emotions does art awaken in you? And do those emotions clarify or cloud your understanding of life? While Aristotle lectures on tragedy in the Lyceum's gardens, his former student is creating real tragedies across half the known world. Alexander's conquests reshape the Mediterranean and Near East, destroying empires, founding cities, and stretching Greek culture from Egypt to India. The tutor who taught him Homer at Mieza watches from Athens as the boy becomes something Aristotle's philosophy cannot accommodate, a living god. The relationship between philosopher and conqueror grows increasingly complicated as Alexander's ambitions transcend Greek categories. Aristotle taught that the polis, the city-state of moderate size where citizens know each other, represents the highest form of political organisation. Alexander rules an empire encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures. Aristotle distinguished Greeks from barbarians, suggesting that Greeks are naturally suited for freedom, while others are naturally suited for servitude. Alexander marries Persian princesses, adopts Eastern court customs, and demands that Greeks and Persians alike prostrate before him. Is Alexander betraying his education or transcending it? The question has no easy answer. Some benefits flow to the Lyceum from imperial connection. Ancient sources report that Alexander funds natural research, sending specimens from conquered territories back to his former teacher. Exotic animals, unknown plants, geographical observations. These expand the empirical database that Aristotle's biology requires. Whether the king genuinely cares about scientific knowledge, or merely enjoys displaying generosity to a famous philosopher, remains unclear. More certain is the pain Alexander causes Aristotle personally. Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, accompanies the expedition as official historian. His task is glorifying Alexander's achievements for Greek audiences, crafting the narrative that will shape how history remembers the campaign. Initially, Callisthenes thrives in this role, producing accounts of battles and sieges that magnify the king's heroism. Then comes the crisis of proskynesis. As Alexander absorbs Persian royal customs, he expects the ritual prostration that Persian subjects perform before their king. Greeks find this practice offensive. Prostration is appropriate for gods, not men. To prostrate before Alexander implies his divinity, and Greeks distinguish sharply between mortal rulers and immortal gods. Callisthenes refuses. In a public confrontation, he declines to prostrate, potentially encouraging other Greeks to resist Alexander's demand. The king, increasingly isolated by his own grandeur, interprets refusal as disloyalty. When a conspiracy against Alexander emerges among the royal pages, Callisthenes is implicated, perhaps justly, perhaps as convenient scapegoat. He is arrested, imprisoned, and either executed or left to die in captivity. The sources disagree on details but concur on the outcome. Aristotle's nephew perishes at Alexander's command. How does Aristotle respond? The ancient sources offer frustratingly little. No letter of protest survives, no bitter denunciation, no philosophical reflection on tyranny's corruption of his former student. Perhaps he writes privately to Alexander. If so, the correspondence is lost. Perhaps he maintains discreet silence, recognizing that criticizing the king openly would endanger himself and the Lyceum. Perhaps grief simply resists articulation. What survives is the philosophical work, which can be read as implicit commentary. The analysis of tyranny and the politics gains edge when we know Aristotle watched his student become what he analyzes. Tyrants isolate themselves, eliminate potential rivals, surround themselves with flatterers, and lose capacity for genuine friendship. Alexander's court, by the campaign's end, fits this description precisely. Those who tell him uncomfortable truths risk death. Those who survive are sycophants and servants. The ethics, too, takes on colouring from historical context. Aristotle argues that the good life requires friendship, self-knowledge, and moderation. Excessive honour corrupts. Virtue lies in the mean. Did Aristotle think of Alexander when writing these passages? We cannot know. But readers aware of the relationship cannot help seeing the conqueror's shadow falling across the philosopher's pages. Meanwhile, the Lyceum continues its work. Students come from across Greece and beyond, drawn by Aristotle's reputation and the school's research programs. The library grows, cataloguing knowledge across every field. Collaborators compile constitutions, histories, and natural observations. Whatever happens in distant Persia and India, philosophical inquiry proceeds in Athens. 12 years pass between the Lyceum's founding and Alexander's death. 12 years of lectures, writings, research, the most productive period of Aristotle's life. The treatises that survive mostly date from this period or were shaped by, teaching during it. Ethics, politics, physics, metaphysics, biology, psychology, logic, rhetoric, poetics. The entire Aristotelian system reaches mature form while Alexander is conquering the world. Then, in June of 323 BC, Alexander dies in Babylon. Fever takes him, though rumours of poison circulate immediately. He is 32 years old, master of the largest empire in history, and suddenly gone. The news reaches Athens within weeks. Aristotle knows immediately what follows. Without Alexander, no protection remains for Macedonians in Greece. The resentment suppressed for 13 years will explode. Demosthenes and the anti-Macedonian faction have been waiting for this moment. They will purge Athens of everyone connected to the conqueror. Aristotle begins planning his escape before the mobs gather. The man who analysed tragedy understands he is living one. His former student's death becomes his own catastrophe. Not through hamartia, he made no error, but through the entanglement of philosophy with power that he never fully controlled. The flight that opened our story now approaches. Athens will sin against philosophy, given the chance. Aristotle will not provide that chance. When the powerful fall, who else falls with them, and is there any way to avoid such entanglement? News of Alexander's death spreads through Athens like fire through dry grass. Within days, the city transforms. Demosthenes, exiled for corruption, returns in triumph. The assembly votes for war against Macedon. Citizens who spent 13 years biting their tongues suddenly discover their courage. The anti-Macedonian faction, suppressed but never destroyed, seizes control of Athenian politics. Aristotle watches from the Lyceum and understands immediately. Every Macedonian in Athens now lives under threat. Every connection to Alexander, once a source of protection, becomes evidence for prosecution. The philosopher who tutored the tyrant, who received specimens from imperial conquests, whose nephew served on the royal staff. This philosopher stands near the top of any list of Macedonian collaborators. The charge, when it comes, is impiety, asibeia, the accusation that killed Socrates, deployed now against Socrates' intellectual grandson. Prosecutors claim that a hymn Aristotle wrote for his friend Hermias, the tyrant of Atanius who gave him refuge after Plato's death, treats a mortal man as divine. The hymn praises Hermias' virtue in terms usually reserved for gods. This constitutes religious offence against Athenian custom. The charge is flimsy, everyone knows it and no one cares. Impiety prosecutions in Athens serve political purposes. The jury will vote not on religious technicalities, but on whether they want this Macedonian in their city. After 13 years of submission to Alexander's power, the answer is obvious. Aristotle has options. He could stay, stand trial, deliver a defence speech as Socrates did. The parallel tempts him, aligning himself with the philosophical martyr, demonstrating that Athens still cannot tolerate those who pursue truth. But Aristotle is not Socrates. He has analysed constitutions, studied how democracies function, observed the mechanics of political revenge. He knows Athenian juries decide emotionally that his foreignness counts against him regardless of evidence, that the political moment demands Macedonian blood. More practically, Aristotle has a school to protect. The Lyceum houses decades of research, a library of unprecedented scope, students and collaborators whose work depends on institutional continuity. Martyrdom might enhance Aristotle's personal reputation. It would destroy everything he built. Theophrastus can lead the school if Aristotle withdraws. Theophrastus cannot save it if Aristotle's trial becomes a spectacle of anti-Macedonian vengeance. The decision crystallizes into a phrase that history preserves. I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. The words simultaneously invoke Socrates and refuse his example. Athens sinned once by killing the gadfly. Aristotle will not provide occasion for repetition. The statement claims moral high ground while acknowledging practical defeat. It lets him leave without appearing to flee. Arrangements proceed quickly. Theophrastus assumes leadership of the Lyceum. Manuscripts remain behind. There is no time and no means to transport decades of accumulated writing. Students scatter or stay according to their own circumstances. Aristotle gathers what he can carry, crosses to the island of Euboea, and settles in Chalcis, his mother's hometown, where family connections provide refuge. Exile. The word has followed him for decades. Orphaned in childhood, rejected by the academy after Plato's death, now driven from the school he founded. Aristotle has spent more of his adult life outside Athens than within it. The city that Greeks consider the centre of civilization has never truly accepted the Macedonian philosopher who taught there. Chalcis offers safety but little else. No students gather for lectures. No research programs continue. No library supports further writing. Aristotle is 62 years old, sick with the stomach ailment that has troubled him for years, cut off from everything that made his life meaningful. The systematic philosopher who categorized all knowledge finds himself in a category he never analyzed. The exile who outlives his usefulness. Correspondence with Theophrastus continues. The Lyceum survives, at least initially. Athenian politics shift as the war against Macedon goes poorly. Within a year, Antipater, Alexander's regent in Greece, defeats the Greek coalition and imposes Macedonian control more firmly than before. The same Athenians who drove Aristotle out now submit again to the power they briefly defied. But this reversal comes too late. Aristotle's health deteriorates through the winter and spring. The stomach pains intensify. Ancient sources, always eager for dramatic detail, suggest poison, either administered by enemies or self-inflicted to avoid prolonged suffering. More likely, disease simply runs its course. A body that spent decades in relentless intellectual labour finally fails. In the autumn of 322 BC, roughly a year after, fleeing Athens, Aristotle dies in Chalcis. He is 62 years old. His will survives, providing for his children, his slaves, and his companion Herpyllis, who bore him a son after Pythias' death. He requests that Pythias' bones be buried with his own, honouring a marriage that ended decades earlier. The instructions are practical, detailed, and unsentimental, characteristic of a mind that systematized everything, including its own termination. The Lyceum endures under Theophrastus, then Strato, then a succession of leaders who gradually diverge from Aristotelian orthodoxy. The manuscripts remain in Athens initially, then pass through strange adventures, hidden in a cellar, damaged by moisture, rediscovered, edited, and finally transmitted to the wider world. The system Aristotle built outlasts the school he founded. But in the autumn of 322 BC, none of this is certain. A philosopher dies in exile, his reputation under attack, his school's future unclear. The man who asked, "What makes a life good?" faces his own ending far from home. Whether his life achieved eudaimonia, the flourishing he spent decades analysing, depends on criteria he himself established. Virtue exercised over a complete lifetime, goods of fortune as well as goods of character, a whole life, not just moments of achievement. By those criteria the verdict is mixed. Virtue, certainly. Intellectual excellence pursued with unsurpassed dedication. External goods, for most of his life. Students, resources, recognition, meaningful work. But the ending shadows everything. Exile, illness, the nephew's death unavenged, the student's empire already fracturing. The complete life Aristotle's ethics demands was not in the end complete. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson. Even the philosopher who understood flourishing best could not secure it for himself. Fortune remains beyond our control. Virtue is necessary but not sufficient. The good life requires luck, and luck ran out in Chalcis. When we judge a life, should we weigh the ending more heavily than the middle? Or does the whole trajectory matter equally? Aristotle dies in 322 BC, but his writings begin a journey stranger than any he undertook while living. The treatises we read today, dense, technical, world-shaping, survived through accidents that nearly destroyed them. Understanding how they reached us illuminates how fragile intellectual transmission truly is. The immediate aftermath seems secure. Theophrastus inherits leadership of the Lyceum and possession of Aristotle's library, including the master's own manuscripts. For 36 years, Theophrastus maintains the school, continuing research programs, preserving texts, training new generations of peripatetics. When he dies in 287 BC, the library passes to Neleus, a student whose family came from Skepsis, a small town in Asia Minor. Here the story takes a strange turn. Neleus carries the manuscripts to Skepsis, removing them from the Lyceum and from Athens. Why he does this remains unclear. Perhaps he hoped to establish his own school. Perhaps he disagreed with the new Lyceum leadership. Perhaps he simply wanted to possess the treasures his teacher bequeathed him. Whatever the motive, the action severs Aristotle's texts from the institution that should have preserved them. The Lyceum continues without the manuscripts. Later, peripatetics work from memory, from copies of varying quality from secondary sources. The school survives, but gradually loses access to the master's own words. Meanwhile, in Skepsis, Neleus's heirs do something inexplicable. They hide the manuscripts in a cellar. The reason, according to Strabo, is fear. The Attalid kings of Pergamum are aggressively collecting books for their great library, competing with Alexandria for cultural prestige. If the kings learn that Aristotle's manuscripts exist in Sepsis, they will seize them. Rather than surrender the texts, Neleus's descendants bury them underground, where they remain for perhaps a century and a half. A cellar in Asia Minor is not an archive. Moisture seeps through stone. Insects burrow into papyrus. Mice gnaw what insects leave. When the manuscripts finally emerge, sold to a book collector named Apellicon around 100 BC, they are damaged, disordered, and incomplete. Apellicon attempts restoration, filling gaps with his own conjectures, not always accurately. He brings the texts to Athens, where they remain until the Roman general Sulla captures the city in 86 BC. Sulla ships Apellicon's library to Rome as war spoils. There the manuscripts attract scholarly attention. Andronicus of Rhodes, a peripatetic philosopher, takes on the enormous task of editing, organising and publishing Aristotle's works. The edition he produces around 60 BC becomes the basis for all subsequent transmission. What we read as Aristotle is largely Andronicus's arrangement of texts that passed through sellers, collectors and conquerors before reaching stable form. This history raises unsettling questions. How much was lost in the sepsis cellar? How much did Apellicon's restorations corrupt? How faithfully does Andronicus's edition represent Aristotle's intentions? The treatises we possess are not polished works prepared for publication, but lecture notes, research drafts, texts revised repeatedly for different purposes. Their difficulty partly reflects this origin. These are working documents, not finished compositions. Aristotle's published works, dialogues written in polished literary style, praised in antiquity for their eloquence, are almost entirely lost. Cicero admired their golden river of language. We possess only fragments and titles. What survives is the esoteric work, the internal school material never intended for general audiences. The Aristotle known to the ancient reading public has vanished. The Aristotle known to specialists has endured. Meanwhile, the manuscripts travel further. Arab scholars, working in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age, translate Aristotle into Arabic, often via Syriac intermediaries. Philosophers, like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes study, comment upon, and develop Aristotelian ideas within Islamic intellectual culture. For centuries, the most sophisticated Aristotelian scholarship occurs not in Christian Europe, but in the Islamic world. Western Europe largely loses access to Aristotle during the early medieval period. Only the logical works translated into Latin by Boethius in the 6th century remain continuously available. The physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics. These disappear from Western consciousness, preserved only in Arabic translations that Christian scholars cannot read. The recovery begins in the 12th century. Translators working in Spain, Sicily, and the Latin East render Arabic versions into Latin, sometimes adding Arabic commentaries that shape how Europeans understand the texts. By the 13th century, the full Aristotelian corpus becomes available in Latin, transforming European intellectual life. The reaction is not universally welcoming. Aristotle's teachings on the eternity of the world, the mortality of the individual soul, and the limits of divine providence conflict with Christian doctrine. Church authorities repeatedly ban the teaching of Aristotelian natural philosophy, but the power of the system proves irresistible. Albertus Magnus and his student Thomas Aquinas undertake the monumental project of synthesizing Aristotle with Christianity, producing the scholastic philosophy that will dominate European thought for centuries. Aquinas treats Aristotle simply as the philosopher, the definitive authority on natural reason, requiring only correction on points where revelation provides superior knowledge. The unmoved mover becomes the Christian God. The teleological cosmos becomes divine creation. The ethical virtues become foundations for theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Aristotle is baptized, his pagan philosophy absorbed into Christian synthesis. This synthesis shaped Western culture profoundly. Universities organized around Aristotelian curriculum taught generations of lawyers, doctors, and clergy. Scientific inquiry proceeded within Aristotelian frameworks until the 17th century. Political theory assumed Aristotelian categories of constitution and citizenship. The philosopher who died in exile became the intellectual authority of European civilization, all because some manuscripts survived a cellar in Skepsis, because a Roman general looted a library, because Arab scholars found Greek philosophy worth preserving, because medieval translators rendered Arabic into Latin. At every stage, the transmission could have failed. What we call Western philosophy might have developed without its central figure. The fragility haunts anyone who cares about ideas. How many Aristotles were lost, thinkers whose works did not survive the accidents of transmission? How much knowledge disappeared in burned libraries, neglected archives, deliberate destruction? What we possess is what happened to survive. The history of thought is also a history of loss. How much of what we consider foundational knowledge exists only because of accidents, and what might we be missing that did not survive? Modern science does not begin with Aristotle, it begins against him. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries defines itself through rejection of Aristotelian physics. Galileo drops weights from towers to refute claims about falling bodies. Newton constructs mathematical laws that explain motion without purposes. Darwin describes species change through natural selection, not fixed essences. The authority that dominated Western thought for 2 millennia becomes an obstacle to be overcome, yet this very opposition testifies to Aristotle's significance. You do not rebel against what does not matter. The scientific revolution required dismantling Aristotelian edifice, because that edifice structured everything: how Europeans understood motion, causation, life, and cosmos. Even in rejection, Aristotle shapes the questions science addresses. His errors are instructive. Aristotle believed heavy objects fall faster than light ones. Direct observation seems to confirm this. A stone drops quicker than a feather. But Galileo recognized that air resistance complicates the comparison. In vacuum, all objects fall at the same rate regardless of weight. Aristotle observed accurately but generalized incorrectly, missing the hidden variable that distorted his conclusions. Similarly with projectile motion. Aristotle struggled to explain why thrown objects continue moving after leaving the thrower's hand. His physics requires continuous contact between mover and moved. He proposed that air displaced by the projectile rushes behind it, pushing it forward, an ingenious but false explanation. Newton's first law resolves the puzzle. Objects in motion remain in motion unless acted upon by external force, no continuous pushing required. The celestial physics fares no better. Aristotle divided the cosmos into sublunary and superlunary realms with different natures. Below the moon, 4 elements, earth, water, air, fire, move in straight lines, toward natural places. Above the moon, a 5th element, ether, moves eternally in perfect circles. This distinction preserved celestial perfection against terrestrial corruption, but collapsed when Galileo observed mountains on the moon and sunspots on the sun. The heavens are not perfect, the same physics governs everywhere. Yet the method underlying these errors contains something valuable. Aristotle insisted on explaining natural phenomena through natural causes without invoking divine intervention for ordinary events. He sought regularities, patterns, principles that make nature intelligible. His explanations failed, but his commitment to finding explanations succeeded in shaping scientific aspiration. The biological works age better. Darwin admired Aristotle's observations, telling a colleague that Linnaeus and Cuvier have been my 2 gods, but they were mere schoolboys compared to old Aristotle. The praise acknowledges what modern biology inherited: attention to diversity, systematic classification, functional explanation, developmental observation. Aristotle got specific claims wrong, but he established biology as a discipline. His teleology remains controversial. Modern biology explains adaptation through natural selection, a purposeless process that produces purposive-looking results. Eyes exist not for seeing, in any intentional sense, but because organisms with eyes outcompeted those without. Yet biologists still speak of function, of what organs are for, of adaptive advantage. The language of purpose persists even when the metaphysics is rejected. Perhaps teleology is dispensable in theory, but indispensable in practice. Asking what a structure is for generates hypotheses about its operation. Understanding the heart as for pumping blood guides investigation even if hearts were not designed. Aristotle's framework, stripped of metaphysical commitments, remains useful heuristic. The broader influence runs deeper still. Aristotle established that nature is intelligible, that patient observation reveals regular patterns, that explanation is both possible and valuable. These commitments, absorbed so thoroughly into Western culture that they seem obvious, were not inevitable. Other civilizations developed sophisticated technologies without developing theoretical science. The Greek conviction that nature operates according to discoverable principles, a conviction Aristotle did more than anyone to articulate and demonstrate, made modern science thinkable. Even the concept of scientific disciplines reflects Aristotelian organization. He distinguished physics from biology, from psychology, from ethics, each with its own subject matter and methods. This division of intellectual labour, foreign to earlier Greek thought where philosophers addressed everything at once, created space for specialised expertise. Scientists today work within disciplines Aristotle defined even if the content has transformed beyond recognition. The universities that trained scientists for centuries were Aristotelian institutions. The curriculum of liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, derived from classical models that Aristotle influenced. The practice of systematic inquiry, organised research, collaborative knowledge production. These characterised the Lyceum before they characterised modern laboratories. The institution of organised science owes something to the institution Aristotle founded. Critics rightly note that Aristotelian authority also hindered science. When Galileo's observations contradicted Aristotelian physics, some opponents refused to look through the telescope. Loyalty to texts trumped attention to evidence. The scholastic synthesis, however magnificent intellectually, could become a prison preventing new thought. Breaking free required not just new discoveries, but new attitudes toward authority itself. This too is part of the legacy. Modern science defines itself through rejection of authority, through insistence that evidence overrules tradition, through willingness to discard any theory that fails empirical test. Aristotle himself endorsed this attitude in principle. Truth matters more than loyalty to teachers. That his followers forgot this principle does not diminish its importance. The philosopher of nature remains present in the science that superseded him, not in specific doctrines, mostly abandoned, but in the commitment to understanding, the organization of inquiry, the conviction that nature makes sense. These gifts survive the rejection of physics that could not survive telescope and experiment. How do we honor intellectual ancestors whose specific teachings we must reject? And what do we owe to those whose errors we learn from? Dante Alighieri, writing the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, places Aristotle in limbo, the first circle of hell, reserved for virtuous pagans who lived before Christ. No punishment afflicts them, only the sorrow of separation from God. Among the noble spirits gathered there, Aristotle occupies the seat of highest honour. Dante calls him the master of those who know, il maestro di color che sanno. The phrase captures medieval Europe's attitude precisely. For 3 centuries before Dante, Aristotle had been simply the philosopher, the authority requiring no name because no other philosopher matched his stature. His system organised the medieval curriculum. His logic trained minds for theology and law. His natural philosophy explained the physical world. His ethics guided reflection on the good life. To be educated meant to know Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas achieved the defining synthesis. Writing in the 13th century, Aquinas recognised that Aristotle's philosophy could serve Christian theology rather than threaten it. The unmoved mover becomes the God of Scripture, pure actuality who creates and sustains all being. The teleological cosmos becomes divine providence, ordering creation toward its proper ends. Natural law, derived from rational reflection on human nature, prepares for divine law revealed in Scripture. The synthesis required adjustments. Aristotle taught the eternity of the world. Christianity requires creation in time. Aristotle suggested the mortality of individual souls. Christianity promises resurrection and eternal life. Aristotle's God thinks only itself. Christianity's God knows and loves each creature. Aquinas acknowledged these conflicts while arguing that reason, properly applied, reaches conclusions compatible with faith, and faith illuminates what reason alone cannot grasp. For centuries, Thomistic Aristotelianism dominated Catholic intellectual life. Seminaries taught it, universities organised around it, councils endorsed it. Even today, Aquinas remains the common doctor of the Catholic Church, and Aristotle remains the philosophical foundation on which Thomistic theology builds. Protestant reformers rejected much of this synthesis, suspicious of pagan philosophy contaminating Christian truth. Luther called Aristotle that buffoon who has misled the Church, and advocated removing his works from university curricula. The Reformation's emphasis on Scripture alone challenged the authority of philosophical reason, yet even Protestant theology could not entirely escape Aristotelian categories. The very language of substance, essence, and causation, fundamental to theological debate, derived from Aristotelian metaphysics. Islamic philosophy had reached similar synthesis centuries earlier. Al-Farabi, writing in the 10th century, integrated Aristotelian thought with Islamic theology. Avicenna developed metaphysical arguments that influenced both Islamic and Christian philosophy. Averroes, the commentator whose interpretations shaped how Europeans read Aristotle, argued that philosophical truth and religious truth could not ultimately conflict, since both derived from the same divine source. Jewish philosophers likewise engaged the Aristotelian corpus. Maimonides, the greatest medieval Jewish thinker, wrote his guide for the perplexed to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Torah. Like Aquinas after him, Maimonides believed that reason and revelation illuminate each other, that philosophical inquiry strengthens rather than weakens faith. The 3 Abrahamic traditions thus share Aristotelian heritage. Debates about God's nature, the soul's immortality, the foundations of ethics, and the structure of reality occurred within frameworks Aristotle established. Theologians disagreed fiercely about conclusions while accepting common categories and methods. The master of those who know became master of how they argued. Beyond theology, Aristotle shaped how Europeans organised knowledge itself, the division of philosophy into logic, physics and ethics, the distinction between theoretical and practical sciences, the hierarchy of disciplines from particular to universal. These structures reflected Aristotelian classifications. Medieval universities taught the trivium and quadrivium, curricula derived from classical models Aristotle helped shape. To be educated meant to internalise Aristotelian organisation of learning. Political thought drew similar resources. The analysis of constitutions, the distinction between legitimate and deviant regimes, the argument that humans are political by nature. These Aristotelian themes echoed through medieval and early modern political theory. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke defined themselves against Aristotelian politics, but the very questions they addressed, the origins of government, the basis of obligation, the purpose of the state, were questions Aristotle posed. Even rhetoric and poetics bore his mark. The rhetoric, rediscovered along with other works in the 13th century, influenced how Europeans thought about persuasion, argument, and public speech. The poetics, fragmentary as it was, shaped literary criticism from Renaissance humanism through neoclassical drama. The unities of action, time and place that governed French tragedy derived, not entirely accurately, from Aristotelian principles. The breadth is staggering. Logic, physics, biology, psychology, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics. Aristotle wrote foundationally on every major field of inquiry recognised in his time, and his influence extended to fields like theology that he never addressed directly. No other thinker has shaped Western civilization so comprehensively. This dominance eventually became a problem. When authority replaces inquiry, knowledge stagnates. The scientific revolution required challenging Aristotelian physics precisely because Aristotelian physics had become dogma rather than hypothesis. The Enlightenment's rejection of tradition targeted scholastic Aristotelianism as paradigm of intellectual servility. Modernity defines itself partly through liberation from Aristotelian authority. Yet even in rejection, Aristotle persists. We organise knowledge into disciplines he distinguished. We argue using logical forms he analysed. We ask ethical questions he posed. We study nature expecting intelligible patterns he promised. The master of those who know remains master even of those who forgot they know him. What makes an authority worth following, and how do we know when to follow no longer? We return now to where we began. An ageing philosopher flees Athens in the autumn of 322 BC, one step ahead of an impiety charge, his life's work abandoned, his future uncertain. Aristotle settles in Chalcis, his mother's hometown, and dies within a year. The school he founded passes to Theophrastus. The manuscripts begin their strange journey through cellars and conquests. The man vanishes, the ideas remain. 24 centuries have passed since that flight from Athens. In that time, Aristotle's influence has waxed and waned, been embraced and rejected, shaped civilizations and been superseded by new knowledge. What endures? What can a philosopher dead for over 2,000 years offer minds grappling with problems he never imagined? The method endures. Start with observation. Collect data before theorizing. Respect the phenomena. Aristotle did not always follow his own advice. Theoretical commitment sometimes distorted his observations, but the principle remained sound. Knowledge begins with looking carefully at the world, not with speculation that ignores what lies before our eyes. The questions endure. What is happiness, and how do we achieve it? How should communities organize themselves? What makes an action right or wrong? What is the soul, and what happens when we die? These are not antiquarian curiosities, but living concerns. Every generation must answer them afresh. Aristotle's answers may not be ours, but his framing of the questions shapes how we think about them. The system endures, at least in influence. Contemporary philosophy no longer operates within Aristotelian metaphysics, but the vocabulary of substance and accident, actuality and potentiality, form and matter echoes through discussions that would not exist without him. Scientists reject Aristotelian physics while inheriting Aristotelian commitment to explanatory understanding. Biologists invoke function while disclaiming teleology. The concepts transform, the origin remains, visible. The ideal endures. The human being is an animal that reasons. Our distinctive excellence lies in exercising rational capacities well, in understanding, in practical wisdom, in contemplation of truth. This vision of human nature grounds educational traditions older than any modern nation. Liberal arts education, the cultivation of critical thinking, the conviction that learning matters intrinsically and not merely instrumentally. These commitments descend from Aristotelian sources. Something else endures, harder to name but perhaps most important. Aristotle demonstrated that systematic inquiry into everything is possible. One person, applying intelligence and discipline, can address the full range of questions that reality poses. Logic and biology, ethics and physics, politics and metaphysics, not as isolated specialties, but as interconnected dimensions of a single project of understanding. The ambition may be unrealizable now, given how knowledge has grown, but the ambition itself remains inspiring. We are heirs to this ambition whether we know it or not. Every time we ask but why, and push for deeper explanation, we continue what Aristotle began. Every time we refuse to accept tradition merely because it is tradition, we honour his example. Every time we observe carefully before theorising wildly, we follow his method. Every time we ask what makes a life worth living, we join a conversation he helped to start. The boy who arrived in Athens at 17, orphaned, foreign, hungry for knowledge, spent the next 45 years pursuing wisdom across every domain of human inquiry. He built an institution that survived his death. He wrote works that survived centuries of neglect. He shaped a civilization that survives even its rejection of his authority. Not bad for a physician's son from the Macedonian frontier. But there is a final lesson, perhaps the most important. Aristotle's life did not end happily. Exile, illness, the nephew's death, the student become tyrant, the school abandoned, the reputation under attack. The philosopher who analysed flourishing did not himself flourish at the end. Fortune matters, as he always acknowledged. Virtue is necessary, but not sufficient. The good life requires luck, and luck is not distributed according to desert. This is not failure of philosophy, but its deepest truth. We pursue the good without guarantees of achieving it. We cultivate virtue knowing that circumstances may overwhelm our best efforts. We build institutions that may outlast us or may crumble the moment we leave. The uncertainty is not reason to abandon the pursuit, but rather the condition within which pursuit makes sense. Philosophy, Aristotle wrote, begins in wonder. It does not end in certainty, but in continued wondering. The Lyceum closed eventually, probably in the 1st century BC, a victim of political upheaval and changing intellectual fashions. The building is gone, the gardens overgrown, the covered walkways, where peripatetics paced and argued long since vanished. But the questions they debated persist. The methods they developed continue to influence inquiry. The texts they preserved still find readers. In that sense, the Academy never truly closed. It simply expanded until it became coextensive with intellectual life itself. Aristotle lies buried somewhere in Chalcis. His bones mingled with Pythias's as he requested, his tomb long since lost, but the student who entered Plato's academy at 17 remains present wherever careful thinking occurs. He's the teacher we never escape, the voice in our heads asking for definitions and distinctions, demanding that we observe before theorizing, insisting that we ask what things are for. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the long shadow of Aristotle. If this exploration has moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to Philosophy Archives and share this with others who might appreciate it. Before you go, I want to leave you with a question, one of Aristotle's own, the question he spent his life trying to answer. What is the good life? What does it mean to flourish as a human being? And are you living that life now? The question echoes across 2.5 millennia, still unanswered, still urgent, still ours. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you calm and peaceful rest.